mean, it's part of your lifestyle where we kind of say, all right, we have social or we have cultural type thing. Cultural will include arts and music in there, where the societal part will say about like for the women's right. And then we'll see, not a part we'll do today, but a lot of that we'll have for a lot of reforms that occurred. All right, the Second Great Awakening, a lot of revivals that we had. We had those camp meetings, if you remember the camp meetings for this time. Cane Ridge was a camp meeting that had over 30,000 people in Kentucky. Charles Finney went all around the area of New York and had audiences. A lot like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield of the First Great Awakening. These preachers with some impassioned sermons, a lot of emotion in it. But some other aspects that we had. The Baptist Church and the Methodist Church, they would both grow. And they would become our largest Protestant denominations that we would have. And some of you, here in Inverness, our largest churches besides the Catholic Church are Baptist and Methodist. And that would be something that happened. The Catholic Church would end up growing, except in other areas once we'd have more immigrants coming in after this time period. Another thing that ended up happening was a lot of African American churches came about. This is where you might see the AME churches. Now, why? Why are we having these African American churches?
Because the white people didn't have them.
And this is what was happening. Is simply that where before, even in the South, slave owners used to bring their slaves to church with them. But we became, especially after Nat Turner's rebellion, more and more of a segregated society. And we would have a split of a lot of churches. Now, what issue would split churches? Yeah, the issue of slavery. Our largest Protestant denomination today is the Southern Baptist Convention. Any guess of why they're called the Southern Baptists?
They were for slavery.
Yeah, they were the ones for the South, which then it came the argument when you would have church leaders from the North and the South together. And that does not mean that all religious leaders in the South were for slavery. But this is where it was an issue that you have. Notice that this says the United Methodist Church. The Methodist Church split with North and South. In the 1960s, I believe, they united back together. There's actually a movement trying to get some of the African Methodist churches to come in and also join in together now with the United Methodist Church and come back all together as one Methodist church. That hasn't happened yet, so there's Southern Baptist Convention. All right, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. What are they better known as? For what group of people?
Mormons.
Yeah, it's the Mormons. Now, we're going to see they're kind of, I have them here, we're kind of with religion, but I'll mention them also when we talk about utopian communities. They are founded in 1830 by Joseph Smith. He writes the Book of Mormon. No, not the play. This is where he would write the Book of Mormon. I hate to say it, but one of the great way to kind of know, to learn some of the history of the Mormon Church, which they're making fun of it, but they tell a lot of things with it. Is actually with South Park. And yeah, I did try to find with the episode that they have on it, but no, they don't have it on YouTube because that's where the closest thing I could find was where a person was kind of breaking it apart and telling about it, going back and forth. But where they have a new kid coming to town.
Didn't he like make up a story or something?
Yeah, and he was telling the story. But what they do in South Park is they have a part where they're kind of doing this tune with it, but then they were going dum 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 dum. All right, basically calling it dumb the whole time because Joseph Smith, where he goes out into the woods, he meets an angel. He ends up basically this is where he is as a prophet. But they actually tell a lot of the history of the Mormon, the founding of the church that way. So, yeah.
Is this where he like went out and found those tablets, but no one else could look at them?
Right.
Exactly.
Right, and that's where he got basically the information for writing the Book of Mormon. So as I said, South Park makes fun of it, but they actually tell the history.
So he went out into the woods and he wrote a tablet.
Well, he found these tablets. The angel gave him some tablets that gave him the information. So.
Like Steve Jobs.
And Romney's a Mormon, right?
Right. Mitt Romney is, and Harry Reid, our president of the Senate, is Mormon also. This is why actually when you look in government today, the only Protestant that we have in all of our top positions and in government now is Barack Obama. Because all the rest are either Mormon, Catholic, or Jewish.
I thought he was Muslim.
No, he is not Muslim. That's the only way groups want to say, and they have with that. Which is kind of funny when groups go and say that, oh, he's Muslim, but then they'll turn around and point out that, oh, but he was a member of Jeremiah Wright's church for 20-something years, which is a black Christian church. So it's kind of it's like, okay, you want to criticize him for this and this, but they're two complete different things. All right. Joseph Smith, he would get followers in the Mormon Church, and the followers would move to Illinois. Eventually, they moved to Illinois, and there Joseph Smith was killed by a mob. The Mormons faced a lot of persecution. Why? What? Well, their beliefs were different. And I don't want to get into a religious argument over here, over everything. Because some people say they're Christian, some people that won't. This is where, even in the politics, this is where some groups in the primaries were saying, well, the Mormons were a cult. But this is where, for that part, they are. And also, there's also different groups within the Mormon Church. But this is where, for them, they faced persecution. And one of the things that it was is, if you know anything about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they believe in a clean life. They believe in a family life. This is where kind of the joke is. Mitt Romney is not going to go and have a beer with somebody and not be a common man having a beer with them because they don't drink alcohol. In fact, they don't drink tea. If you are a practicing Mormon, you don't drink tea because in the Book of Mormon, you don't have tea. Now, here's where it depends on whether they are a more fundamental Mormon or not. Can you drink Coca-Cola? See, the fundamentals will say no, because the reason why you couldn't drink tea or coffee as a Mormon is because caffeine was a drug. But this is where some will say, oh, well, it doesn't say anything about Coca-Cola. Well, it wasn't around in 1830. So this is why a lot of times there'll be a joke that, oh, you can't sit down and have a beer with Mitt Romney, but you can sit down and have a caffeine-free Diet Coke. But they lived a very clean lifestyle. They are very family-orientated. That's the principles of the Book of Mormon that you have. Are they going to be more successful than their neighbors that are farming if they are living a clean lifestyle? Yes. Okay, the person that's not waking up with a hangover is probably going to be a better farmer over time. So, they are different, but they are, as a whole, more successful. Well, people get jealous. And so this is where the jealousy comes in. Okay, it's not the fact that, oh, well, look, his crops are doing better than mine. Okay? Now, there was one other issue that would also set the Mormons apart that would face persecution besides jealousy. Anyone know what issue that is?
Multiple wives?
Yes, multiple wives. The church practiced polygamy. Now, with polygamy, the idea was not, and this is where some people think, oh, well, it's this man, he wants to have a whole bunch of wives. No, you don't want to have multiple wives. That's just that many more people nagging you. Okay? I mean, why would you want more than one? Okay? No, but what it was is that this is part of where you have, and part of, no matter what religious group it is to take care of your widows and children. Well, if they're facing persecution, and some of them men were killed, you are going to have more women and children and orphans there. But for a lot of the widows, and part of the idea was if you were successful enough, you could marry a second or a third wife. And most of the Mormons did not have multiple wives. And the thing is every wife had to be treated as equal. And normally what would end up happening, and I know for some of you this is not going to put a pretty picture in your face, but it wouldn't be like, okay, there's a 25-year-old and he has two wives that are in their 20s. what it would be is there might be a man that's in his 35, 40 years old, and he has his wife from the last 20 years, and now he's more successful. Well, he gets now another younger wife. And it almost ends up like an extended family along the way. Yeah.
Do you think people would still, as many people would like Mitt Romney, he had one wife, he had multiple wives?
I think in America today that would be something that would be seen as too different. The Mormon Church today officially does not espouse that. They have not since, I think, 1890. Are there groups that claim to be Mormon that will still practice that illegally? Yeah, some of you've seen like the show Sister Wives and all. Actually, most of those groups aren't even in Utah. Most of them have moved to the mountains of Nevada there. But there are certain sects
Are
of
they
groups
allowed
that they
to
have.
be illegally
No, you're not legally allowed to have more than one wife.
That's
All right. Joseph Smith dies though. A guy by the name of Brigham Young takes over. After persecution, Brigham Young decides to lead them to Utah. Or Zion, New Zion. But that's where it goes to Utah. Now, Utah is a high desert.
Yeah.
What does it mean by a high desert? Well, first of all, what's a desert?
No water.
Yeah, lack of water. So high desert would be high altitude, okay, without water. I'll tell you that there are parts of Utah that are absolutely beautiful. There are parts of it, I know flying over, the first time I ever flew over, I looked down and it's just a whole lot of brown. Okay, it's a high, dry area. They settle on the shores of the Great Salt Lake. Why is it called the Great Salt Lake? Salt water. So you have a high altitude, so basically mountains, desert, and your biggest thing of water is salty. Sound like a great place for a bunch of farmers to move to?
Yeah.
So why do they move there?
No one else wants it.
Because they wouldn't get persecuted out there?
So they basically figured nobody else wanted it. Plus there was a little bit of argument, did we own it or did Mexico own it? Really weren't sure about that, so kind of, okay, we'll play this gray area. They work out a deal with the Ute Indians. That's why University of Utah is the Utes. They work out a deal with the Ute Indians, and they move there. I mean, as whole families, they go out there, and they, on the shores of the Great Salt Lake, they then make this new community. They have supplies. This is, when you talk about from going from the cities around the area of Chicago, we're talking about a 4 to 5 month wagon ride. So it's not like, oh, we can go back and forth for supplies. It is a permanent move. They get out there, they have their supplies for the first year. The second year, they are growing crops, and they have a problem. They aren't locusts, all right, but they are, you think of something like here in Florida, we have our great lovers, is what I always have in there. You know, those giant grasshopper type things. Well, this is basically, you have things like that come in and start eating the crops. Now, what do you do if you have your food, I mean, in winters in Salt Lake, I've been to Salt Lake City for skiing, it's great skiing there. But it's one of the things you watch and you see, your food for this winter getting eaten up by bugs.
Pesticide.
Except for they didn't have pesticides at that time.
Water.
Nuka?
That's salt on them.
The salt on them, but how's the salt going to work with the crops? It's going to kill the crops. At least none of you said. I usually have someone say, set the field on fire. Yeah, that might kill the bugs, but
Good grasshopper pitching.
You don't even worry about it.
don't worry about it.
Get something out of
Shoot them.
Or pray.
Yes, pray.
And here's where the story then about for what became known as Mormon crickets were. They prayed, and we had an influx of what? Come and save them.
Birds.
What type of birds?
Pigeon.
Seagulls.
Seagulls.
And as you go around Salt Lake, and this is actually near Temple Square. I spent 10 days in Salt Lake City this last summer. I'll spend this next summer. That's where we'll be doing the AP grading. But this is where at Temple Square, and you have different monuments that they have seagulls up on the top. And some of the things. This is where again, kind of tell you about stories. Stories have kind of grown over time. We do know that seagulls helped them out. And what we kind of know is that some of the communities, because it wasn't just one community, there were various communities, that seagulls might have helped more than in others. The way the story, I remember when I first heard it, said, oh, there weren't even seagulls around the Great Salt Lake before that, and that they flew in. All right, well, turns out that, yeah, there were seagulls in that area before. So that part of the story wouldn't be true if it was told. And what they think with some areas is the seagulls helped out. But it makes for a good story that, hey, they prayed, here's a miracle. But we do know that seagulls ended up eating a lot of these Mormon crickets they had. But the Mormons would live in Utah, and here's where they kind of were off on their own. I mentioned 1890. They would not become a state until 1890 because what issue caused conflict with them?
The album.
Not slavery.
What was next?
And I believe this is Brigham Young with his wives.
Oh my god.
Now, although most Mormons did not have that many of multiple wives, okay, this is where there were some. And if you ever know, this is where Brigham Young University is, located in Provo, Utah. Alright, this next thing is not a religion, but it's almost like a religion. It's more of a philosophy, but it's also a writing style. Alright, Transcendentalism. Conflict is over polygamy. Yeah, that's, when they were wanting to become a state, basically, and this is where we come to that whole argument: federal government, state government. States are allowed to make their own marriage laws, but this is where the federal government said, we're not going to let you come in and allow polygamy. So it was not until the state of Utah basically made it where it was illegal to have polygamy that the United States would allow Utah in as a state.
How do you spell polygamy?
Polygamy.
Okay. Of course, okay.
Alright, Transcendentalism, it is a writing style, but it's also a philosophy. Now, they stress individualism. Each of you, you're your own person. Okay, and to build your own person. Nature. And you're going to see that come up again and again. The idea that we have things and being based on nature. The idea of self-reliance. We also have it where they reason and understanding. And some of you, this might sound familiar. You kind of think almost like yoga or something, but this is philosophy. But you want to find your inner self out there. So they did. They questioned the established churches. Wait a minute, why is it that the Episcopal Church is saying this? Why is the Baptist Church in here? And it's, you don't need to be a flock going there. You are individualistic. So they had it. And one other thing, and this is what makes it for that time period, consumerism. All those new inventions, all these new factories, maybe they're becoming too consumeristic. They were involved in a lot of the reforms that we're going to see in this other part. Two most famous people are Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Now, there are a lot of things that they wrote. Ralph Waldo Emerson, his essay Self-Reliance is kind of like the basis of the ideas for Transcendentalism. Haley, you need to stand back?
No.
Henry David Thoreau, now here's one of his most famous essays, Civil Disobedience. Isn't so much important for that time period, but it would be really important in the history later on. A guy by the name of Gandhi would use that as his basis. A guy by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. would use that as his basis. But the idea of civil disobedience is if you believe in something, you are willing to get arrested. You are willing to fight for something. Anyway, and again, you take Martin Luther King Jr. and they lived life. Now, the book Walden kind of exemplifies what the Transcendentalists believe, but it also kind of shows with us. You see this picture of this little cabin, because Henry David Thoreau supposedly lived there in Massachusetts off this little cabin on the side, and he was self-reliant. He wasn't going and having it where he's going to Walmart every day. Except for he really wasn't. He was getting in touch with nature, but every morning he walked into town and went to the general store and bought his stuff. I mean, it sounds real good, but it wasn't like he went out and where we have people that will go out and live and truly live off the land. He wasn't living off the land. But it was part of this idea. How you think about it, we'll have this later on. We'll have writers in the 20s with the Lost Generation. We'll have writers in the 50s with the Beatniks. Things are going too fast. We've got to change things up. All right, I'm going to stop right there. Yes. Here was Transcendentalist. Notice a whole lot of different things there that they have for their philosophy: individualism, nature, self-reliance, reason, and understanding. You see some of the stuff coming from more of a science. They were against consumerism and all the materialism that was occurring at that time. The two most famous transcendentalists we have are Emerson and Thoreau. Their titles of some of their things even help to tell what it's about. Emerson was self-reliance. Thoreau with civil disobedience, which would become more important in the future, not as much at that time. Now, what is utopia? Perfect place. And we will have a lot of different utopian communities. This is something that occurs time and time again in history. What ends up happening at this time is we're going to have two different types. Some that are religious and some that are more for society here. First of all, the religious ones. The Mormons, this is where they moved to New Zion or to Utah. But another group was called the Shakers. Now the Shakers were, and you see this picture, you'll see the men are separate than the women. One thing that they had is, this is where you'll sometimes see this word commune. They held all their property as common property. So the idea, get it perfect, everybody is equal is the idea of this. The Shakers had become really big in the mid-1800s, but they died out. One of their philosophies didn't help very much because they forbid marriage and sex.
What?
Usually it's not something you have for a religion. Most religions encourage more children. Why do you encourage your followers? Yeah, your religion will naturally grow if you encourage. If you're a good Catholic and have a bunch of kids, that's more Catholics. Okay, so that's where they were the opposite. And yeah, by the end of the 1800s and before we 1900, they pretty much died out.
Nobody thought about that.
One of the lasting things that we have for Shakers is their architecture of furniture. I mean, their style that they were, because one thing they did is they made furniture in their communes together. But yeah, we also would have another one, I don't have them in the notes, but are called Millerites. And the Millerites, they had their communities, and they were together because they thought that the second coming of Christ was coming, and they had a date in the 1840s that the world was going to end, and it didn't at that time. Which we have, that happened at various times with different religious groups there. Now, the ones that are most famous utopian ones are social experiments. The first one, and get to recognize these names, New Harmony. This one was founded by Robert Owen. Robert Owen moved here from Europe. What it was is he was a well, today we'd be millionaire, but he had made a lot of money with the Industrial Revolution. He started this community because he said, this is where we're going too much to be in materialistic and consumeristic. And so he started New Harmony, and it was in reaction to that. Then we would have Brook Farm. Notice I have this one bolded and underlined. This is the one that is usually the most famous of it. It was in Massachusetts. A lot of authors at that time, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Ralph Waldo Emerson, supported it. Hawthorne actually lived there for a while. And what happened with Brook Farm is that they were trying to get away from the hustle and bustle of society. They're all essentially equal. They're working together. But what ends up happening is, well, I'll go into a second here and give an example of why. But where I said they're getting away, they're kind of living back on the land. Why would that attract transcendentalists?
Because they believe in self-reliance.
All right, self-reliance. Getting back to nature. Okay, getting away from all that consumer. So this is why the transcendentalists, this goes hand in hand together. Now, New Harmony and Brook Farm would ultimately fail. And this is what ends up happening with a lot of utopian communities that we'll have at various times in history. See, the idea that everybody is equal sounds good. But if we're all equal, we're going to live in one community all together. We're going to share the work. So that time, we're going to have to go out and farm together. So we all go out and work in the fields today. But while we're working in the fields, Trace is off to the side, playing over in a little creek over to the side, playing with his pet, the frogs that he has found.
Nice.
So he's over here saying froggy, and he's bouncing around while we're out there working in the field. Tonight, we go home, we all have our equal rooms. We have our equal food. So basically our pay is the same. Tomorrow we go back out in the fields. Anybody gonna join Trace?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it more fun to go play with the frogs and play out in the water than sit there with a hoe and plant and work out in the heat?
Good idea on paper, bad idea in actual.
And eventually the people that are, even those of you that have a work ethic and you're sitting there and I can't believe they're doing this, are you going to work as hard as you would otherwise? And so that's why it would ultimately end up failing, because the people that, there are always people that are freeloaders and they're going to try to live off of other people. And those that are harder workers will say, well, why should I make it where Trace can go and play, but that Matthew's now joining him. Of course, Ben and Mikey, they're going to be with them tomorrow. Jessica, she said, I like frogs. Okay, and some of you just say, I don't like work. Okay, so ultimately what ends up happening? In the 1960s, we would have this go again with these different communal things. We call them communes. There was a problem when they would have in the 60s and our flower children growing together. Because they would start things a little bit different, but instead of going off and playing with frogs, maybe this Trace has to free his mind. So he's going to take some acid at that time. Meanwhile, you go to work, and since you're all equal, but even though you don't get paid equal for all, since the man doesn't pay everybody equal, then you all come and we all put our paychecks in together. But Trace, he's using that money together for his acid trip. How long are you going to stay in that community? Who after a little while with our flower children were the only ones left in those communes in the 60s?
Trace.
It was the freeloaders, some of the druggies, while other people went and they left those. Now, that's not saying that all the hippies and everything happened that way, but that's what happened to a lot of those communes. That, again, the idea behind it is good, but it's not always what ends up happening. The one that did last, though, is Oneida. Oneida was in New York. They sometimes have some controversy because remember, this is in the 1830s, 1840s. They believed that, and this kind of is like the 60s, that there is no one relationship. If, okay, Haley, you have a child? It's everybody's child. Okay, it is, all right? All the men in here are its father. All of the women in here are its mothers. Yeah.
Isn't that kind of where like AIDS and stuff started going around and stuff because of that?
Well, for the 1960s, in the 1960s when we had the free love, that helped spread a lot of sexual diseases around. There were sexual diseases at this time. But this is where, I mean, it was, and this is where it's kind of like, we're talking 120 years before the 1960s and the idea of free love. It would survive, not because of free love, but what did anyone know what they would end up making? And let's see if you know what Oneida, it's a brand name. What?
Opium?
No, not opium.
Pancakes road?
No. They made silverware.
That's why they survived.
And they ended up surviving. So they're making silverware. Are they truly getting away from society? No, but they had to find a way. Yes, their community's away, but they had to find something to sell to society. But Oneida is still a silverware now. It's a corporation, and it's fine silverware that you have. All right, literature. We do have the Transcendentalists, which we'll talk about with Emerson and Thoreau. After the War of 1812, we have a lot of other authors. One of the themes that we're going to see there is some more of American themes. We have our American literature come about. Some of our most famous authors, Cooper, Hawthorne, Melville, Whitman. You know some of the books, Last of the Mohicans, The Scarlet Letter, Moby Dick. Walt Whitman becomes one of our leading poets in America at that time. Now, one thing about their style of writing, it was romance. Not romance as in passion. What is romance at that time?
Nature.
Yeah, it's about nature. Extremely descriptive type writing. I know I sort of had a section on this before with Cooper and about how he would, if he walked in this room and he would have 8 pages describing every little thing in the room. So that is where the romance was at that time. Nathaniel Hawthorne with The Scarlet Letter. Okay, Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Okay, they're writing some about our history. Right, but again, it's an American style. The poetry that we would have, okay, would be with our own American style. But all of it kind of was focused on nature more than anything else. All right, architecture. Now, I have on here stress American and common man themes. Again, it's kind of like the literature. We wanted to be with America. Now, our architecture, though, even though you would think, I mean, some places the log cabin is still, I mean, that is, I know the American Story of Us, they say that the log cabin was America's first mobile homes. Okay, it was a way for you to have it. It's like a starter home. But the architecture that we had at that time, we copied Greek styles. And here's where the government comes in. After Jackson, the idea of democracy, we're going to copy the Greeks with their democracy. And so there are a lot of the columns that you're familiar with there, and for a lot of the styles that we would have for the Greek architecture during this time period. For art, please realize the Hudson River School, all of you, pay attention, that is not an actual physical school. It is a school of thought. Okay, so realize that the Hudson River School is a school of thought. We have various artists. Probably the one that's the most famous today that a lot of times you'll have, especially around Christmas, you'll see a lot of his winter scenes, is Thomas Cole. But the pictures that they had was landscapes. And this is where I always remembered it for landscapes because the Hudson River, I mean, that's very, very natural. And if you've ever been up in that area, upstate New York, it's actually a beautiful valley around the Hudson River. But Cole, Church are two of the famous ones. You see some of these paintings that were done with them. This is where the American landscapes that come in. Once again, for American artists, what are we good at? Landscape, nature, something outside is where, when it comes to architecture or to the. All right, now we get to the reform side. When you see the word temperance, you should be thinking anti what?
Alcohol.
Yeah, anti-alcohol. Why is alcohol so bad that all these women are going around and trying to make it illegal? Yeah, their husband, which there was a problem, and this is where. What is there going to be more violence when there's more alcohol? Yeah. The people do stupid things.
Yeah.
Okay, is there more infidelity when there's alcohol?
Yeah.
Okay, for those of you who don't know infidelity, cheating on husbands and wives. And you have to realize, for the United States, in the early 1800s, the average American consumed more than double of alcohol than what the average American consumes today.
That's because the water wasn't.
Well, part was water to start off with, but then part of it was part of our culture after that.
It'll be like being sober.
And it's pretty easy here. The American Temperance Society was started in 1826. Now, the one thing, a lot of women were involved in this. Now, I'm not saying there weren't men involved in it there. We would end up having, I believe, I'm not sure about this, for some reason I'm thinking there were 14 states that had outlawed, or at least parts of states that had outlawed alcohol by the time we get to the Civil War. Maine was the very first state to have prohibition, which is the outlawing of alcohol. One thing they would end up doing is it kind of takes a back seat, and you're going to see this with several of the reforms. It would take a back seat to the issue of slavery. The same women that are fighting for temperance would be some of the same ones that would be fighting to try to end slavery, and said, all right, this is a bigger problem we have. Let's tackle these problems in order. But after the Civil War, we're going to have the Women's Christian Temperance Union that becomes more and more powerful in the late 1800s. And by the time we get to the early 1900s, we would end up having prohibition in the early 1900s during the Progressive Movement. Now, Sylvester Graham. Anyone know what he did? Yes, he made a graham cracker. And why did he make the graham cracker?
So you take away like
Yeah, and that was it. Basically, part of his idea. he was a person with temperance, and when he made his cracker, part of it was if you have a craving for alcohol, you would eat his cracker. For some people that might work. I mean, this is where it wouldn't be, I don't think the physical aspect, maybe mental. I mean, it's like some people, they stop smoking and they end up gaining weight a lot of times because they eat more. But they might have it where, okay, they put a piece of candy in their mouth constantly. Also with Sylvester Graham, and I don't have this as part of our reform movement because there's a lot of little reform movements that are going on. Like I mentioned, the Millerites with the religion. Graham, and there were other ones that had reform for digestive things. And part of what you would look at there is you need to eat a little bit more of a healthier lifestyle. There are certain things you need to do for your digestive tract. Now, for some people, it's great, except for other people can't afford, okay, to go. Just like there are a lot of things you can do and eat an extremely healthy diet, but sometimes just can't afford it to today. All right, those with disabilities. And this is where you're going to see various sayings and some names of people go along with it. Schools for the blind and the deaf. Thomas Gallaudet made a first university or first school that was a school for the deaf. We still have Gallaudet University today. And it's the one that's most famous for. And then we have for mental asylums. And this is where Dorothea Dix comes in. And she also is working on things for prisons, but this is where she saw for both of them. She saw that a lot of our mentally ill were housed in the same places with prisoners. And she had said that this was wrong. She worked to make mental asylums. Now it's kind of funny today we look at it because a lot of times we try to get people out of mental asylums. But it was a lot better than being in a prison. And what would end up happening is we'd have to have more reforms in the mid-1800s for our mental asylums 100 years later because they had become so bad. But she was fighting for it. And she fought for prison reforms, also trying to do more for rehabilitation of the prisoners, not as much for back for punishment. All right, teachers and education. What person should you remember there? Yeah, Horace Mann. Again, this is where some of those people that from our people reports have come in. He's the leading advocate for it. These are the things that he was pushing for. Teacher training schools. A lot of our colleges today started as teacher colleges, a lot of our smaller places. I know like University of South Florida recently played Ball State. Ball State started as a teacher's college. And you'll see several places there. And the idea that you would have is if we're going to basically teach your teachers how to teach. Okay, how is it that children learn? What does it mean by compulsory attendance? Yeah, there's laws that made that happen. There. What is a standardized school year? Yeah, the 9 months what? How many days is it that you all have to go to school? Yeah, 180. Okay, that's part of what we have. Why is it we start school in the fall and then in the spring? Farming. Yeah, for farming. So that all summer long you're working on the farm. That's what y'all did this summer, right?
Yeah.
Or some of our things may be a little outdated. Now, for compulsory education, this is where I have on there that a lot of places had it that you kind of look at things today, what we would say is about a 4th, 5th grade education. Make sure that kids know how to read and write, do the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. Yes, I know they don't all technically start with R's. Yeah, reading, writing, arithmetic. But that was that is you give them a basis of things that they are supposed to have. A lot of Germans, remember our German immigrants that are coming over here, they're getting upset with this, and they're thinking that it's Americanization. Why is it that we're forcing these German immigrants to go to school? Yeah, they don't know English. So yeah, you get your head up. Yeah, we're forcing them to learn English. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. And this is where that nativism, that's not something that is for this time period. But that is part of it. Are we teaching them to be American? Yeah. We don't do anything like that today, right? Nope. Nah, we don't do anything like that. Like second period, all right, we don't make y'all stand up and say the pledge, right? Okay. A couple weeks ago, State of Florida, when we had Freedom Week, we didn't read anything from the Declaration of Independence every day, or the Constitution. Yeah, that's part of the idea of Americanization, and part of the reason we have for schools is one reason you have schools is to make a literate working force, but part of it also is to Americanize people. All right, women. Kind of a little bit on the last section, but industrialization effects in the city. A lot of, if you are a family living in the city, and realize most people still are living in the country, but we are having more and more people move to the cities. Men left for home. What do the women do? Stay home, take care of the kids. Now, if you were a poor family, then a woman might work also some, but for most things, if you were going to be a respectable woman, did a respectable married woman go to work? No. Even where we had for teachers, and this would be in the countryside and in the city, a lot of young women were teachers. And in fact, for a lot of you girls in here, by the time you are 16, 17 years old, you would have been a teacher. And if most kids are only going until the time they are 10, 11 years old, if you are 16, 17 years old, you're going to be teaching. Because you'll be teaching the younger kids. You're not going to be in school yourself. And so what happens is we would have that, and the women would go. Who's earning the money? Now, this is where psychologically does it make it seem like they're more important than in this. Meanwhile, in the agriculture, we have all these advances. Okay, we have the reaper that's being made. We have the still plow. We have these things making it where there's less needed. So the women don't need to do as much with the actual physical work. They are, once again, more in the house and with the children. Does it make them seem as important? And here's where we have, once again, the cult of domesticity. And I don't think I ever gave you a definition for it, but here's a definition for some of you that want to have it. The men were expected and to be responsible for economic and political affairs, while the women were to care of the home and the children. And some of you may have seen this saying, children are to be seen and not heard. And part of the idea was, okay, in some places, even when the father came home, hey, you make sure that you're not in trouble for the father. He's the one earning a living, and some of the ideas that you would have. But this would lead into something. And in all reality, the Industrial Revolution actually made it for women a little bit harder for them when it came down for things for equal rights. But are women going to stand up for that? Now we're going to have a group of women, and this is where you need to be familiar with different women that are here. Also, you're going to notice how things go with it. The Grimke sisters, they really get upset at the fact that when they are fighting against slavery, the fact that they're not allowed to do certain things because they're women. All right, we're fighting for other people's rights, but we don't even have our own rights. And they would be leaders that would then go. For the women's rights movement, I had that the support is stronger in the North. Why is there more support in the North for women's rights than in the South?
Industrialization.
Well, more of the industrialization. Are there more cities? Yeah. You have more of what we would consider a middle class. The South, you will have your planter class, a very small middle class, and then you end up with a lot more that are your smaller farmers and poorer farmers there. So the middle class women are the ones that are kind of doing this. 1848, we would have our first women's rights convention at Seneca Falls. Lady that's probably the most famous for this is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she is early on our leading woman. Lucretia Mott was another woman that was heavily involved in this women's rights convention. It was not just women. Frederick Douglass was there. All right, a lot of the people that had fought for things for slavery. I have over here where they would issue their Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration of Sentiments, and we'll look through and see, Frederick Douglass signed it. You'll see that there are a lot of men on here. Henry Hatley, and there's Jonathan Metcalf. So there are men that are involved in this. They are fighting for equal rights. Now, what type of rights are they wanting?
Voting.
Yeah, voting rights. They want political rights. Then what other legal rights?
They want to be able to work. if they
Jobs
want
with
to.
pay.
And pay was something, although you would think that would be that was actually way down the list. It wasn't as much for equal pay. That would happen later on. A lot of things they're fighting for is legal rights. What happens if your husband dies? Some areas you couldn't even control your property when your husband passed away. You would have to have a brother or your son or some else. So there were still places where legally they didn't have a lot of rights. Here's where I kind of some broad statements. Most Americans agreed with the idea, and it's like there's a lot of things that we have today. But do we want to change things too fast? And there's people saying we need to get this change right now. And other people say, hold on, let's work in that direction. What ultimately would end up happening, though, is a lot of these male leaders that were involved said, listen, we need to focus our issues on what is the biggest problem right now. Our biggest problem is slavery. And so they joined together, and these different movements focused in on the issue of slavery. Now, women, when we men make a promise to you, we always keep it. We said that we would give you the right to vote, all right, but we have to take care of slavery first. All right? Slavery ended with the 13th Amendment in 1865. And it was just a few years later, 1920, that you got the right to vote. So we kept our promise. Okay, there. Took a little bit of time. Okay, and there was little procedural stuff that we had to take care of along the way, and we got distracted. All right, we had to invent baseball and basketball and some other sports. So, but that's where. Now, the woman that's actually going to be the most famous in American history for women's rights is Susan B. Anthony, and this is the woman. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and I believe this is Susan B. Anthony when she is younger. What would end up happening is after the Civil War, Susan B. Anthony would keep fighting for women's rights and get arrested multiple times because they said women were not allowed to vote. So she went and voted and got arrested and thrown into jail. And she gave an example time and time again. When we get to the early 1900s progressive movement, you're going to see not only temperance come back again, but for the women's rights fighting things. Whoa. Should we stand up and read
What
this?
in the?
No.
All right, we're not going to read it all out loud, but if you look in this, the Declaration of Sentiments, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among people. What does that sound like the start of?
The Declaration.
Yeah, the Declaration of Independence. And that's what actually, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Here, but this is where you have, they took from the Declaration of Independence and said it with women. Now, one thing that I will tell you to do when it comes down for things for AP-wise is if you get a topic that maybe isn't your number one topic that you would like to pick, but you have no choice when it comes for essays, is to go back and think SFIs and just write down any SFIs and make sure, all right, I might not know this in depth, but I'm going to show you that I know some history with this. And I will tell you that I not only tell you all to do that, I practice it myself. Several years ago when I was doing stuff for my National Board Certification, I had 6 different tests that I had to take. One of them was on documents. And the document I get this, and I start reading it, and I'm thinking at the very beginning, all right, Declaration of Independence. This is great. Okay, basically I can write all about 1776. And no, that's a little bit, no, it's about women's rights. So that was my documents. Have another section that was on movements. Okay, and that movements that I got was the 1960s feminist movement. So 2 of my 6 sections happen to be on women's rights, which actually I'd say may not be my strength. I actually scored highest on those, and my two of my 3 highest scores that I did were on those parts, so I must have wrote something good on it. But this is where I did what I tell you all to do. I made sure I had Lucretia Mott. I had the Grimke sisters. I threw in these names. I threw in that it was mixed in with all these other movements that were going on. It wasn't just women's rights movement here. All right, abolition. When you see the word abolition, what are they trying to abolish? Slavery. What's the difference between abolition and emancipation?
Freeing the slaves is emancipation and abolition is trying to get rid of the law.
Okay. Right. Emancipation is the freeing of slaves. Abolition is to completely abolish the entire institution. This kind of goes back a little bit from where we were. I don't think I had this before, or I might have in another section. But one of our first groups was the American Colonization Society. Their idea was to transfer slaves to, and you see this tiny little country in Western Africa. We bought that land and made a colony there, and the idea was to send the slaves, or freed slaves, back to Africa. Notice what the capital is. If I remember what the president named. What was the capital named after? Yeah, President Monroe. Their capital is Monrovia. Now, I have two questions on here. Why did some people like this idea? And I say for the wrong reasons. Now, we had both Southerners and Northerners that supported this idea, not always for the interest of let's end slavery.
North wanted to get rid of the slaves because that would make the South's economy like plummet.
Nah, it wasn't that.
The 1/5 promise, it would die out for the South and the North would have more representatives.
That might have been, but that wasn't one of the reasons why for the North they happens. Now for Southern, we'll do the Southern side first. I'm a slave owner, and I know I've got somebody willing to buy my slave, and then they're going to send them back to Africa. Am I going to sell them my best slave? No. I'll probably sell one of you troublemakers. One of you that maybe keeps getting sick. And what am I going to do with that money? Yeah, buy another slave. So is that really going to work real well? So that's one thing in there that some people in the South support. But in the North, and this is something that a lot of people don't realize and don't think about when you look at things for today. We already had a lot of people that were, what term that would come up would be social Darwinist. There were a lot of people in the North that felt that a black was not equal to a white. And even though they didn't like the idea of slavery, did they want free blacks living in their own city? So that's why for a lot of Northerners, they supported this idea to get rid of the free blacks. Well, we'll send them back. Now, what's the problem with the back to Africa?
They learn English.
Well, they're African Americans. What's the African part in it? Well, they're black in their hair. Were they born in Africa? Do they know anything about it? By this time we weren't. There were very few because by 11 or 12, we had outlawed any slaves being transported in from Africa. Now that doesn't mean there were some that were actually brought in illegally, but for the most part, our slaves were homegrown. But this is where the idea didn't really work out because the slaves did not want to be, they wanted to be free. They didn't want to go to Africa. They just wanted to be free. All right, I'm going to actually, for abolitionists, our next section we're going to go even deeper into it, but here's where we have the American Anti-Slavery Society that would start in the 1830s. The name you need to remember with it is William Lloyd Garrison. He was a radical in the ideas that he was seeing. I say he's radical in his views. He included women. Some people did not like the idea of that. He wanted slavery ended immediately and nothing given to the southern plantation owners. This is where the idea of a change and a radical change. Are Southerners even going to listen to that? I mean, that's their livelihood that they have. And you're going to see, we're going to have Garrison more later on. The Liberty Party, this kind of is where we go to our third party, and they are one that in 1840 and 1844, they would run candidates, and this is where the issue of slavery would then be brought up into the presidential campaign. The Whigs weren't touching the issue, the Democrats weren't touching the issue, so the Liberty Party brings it up. They would later on merge together with what would become the Republican Party. Now, a broad word, and here's a word you need to be familiar with, is perfectionism. And this is where we take all these different movements, this religion, this transcendentalism, and the idea that came in is we're going to make the world perfect. And I have on there cure society's ills, because that was kind of their idea. Can we as people go out and fix all the problems that we have in the world? And there's some people that, I mean, we still try it, and it's admirable when you do it, but you can't always do it. And again, this is not just reform movements. Some of the ideas through religion, through, I mean, even when it comes to diet. I mentioned about Graham and other people that, oh, we got digestive reforms. Well, if you end up where people are eating right, will that make it look things are better? And so that's the idea of making a more perfect world that we. All right, and that's the end of this section.